Let's move on to those reinforcement techniques we talked about. Maybe some of these were on your list of things that we've already learned we can do to use as a motivational tool when that's the functional need of a person. The most basic of these techniques is positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means that we add something the person desires as a response to his or her behavior. And when we do that, we strengthen the behavior. All we mean by strengthen is we make it more likely they'll use that behavior again. The reason the word positive is here is because we're adding something to their lives. Sometimes people get confused because in casual language, people often say the word positive nowadays as though it was meant to say encouraging or good. But that's not what we mean by positive here. What we mean by positive is literally this idea of the mathematical function of adding something. And that's why the symbol for positive reinforcement is R+. An example is candy for cleaning your room. Cleaning your room is the behavior I want you to do more often. I want to reinforce it. By giving you a candy as a response to your behavior, I'm more likely that you will strengthen it. I added something you want, and you're going to do that behavior more often. Now, this presumes the person likes candy. I'll speak more about that in a minute. Negative reinforcement is still reinforcement. It still makes behavior happen more frequently. It improves the behavior. And negative reinforcement is just like positive. It's referring to the negative mathematical function. Subtraction is what negative means. It doesn't mean unpleasant or bad. It is not the same as punishment. Negative reinforcement is removing, reducing, or avoiding something undesired as a response to strengthen the behavior. What does that mean? Well, it means that when you did something I want you to do, the reward for you was that you got rid of, or you reduced, or you avoided entirely something that you dislike. An example would be if you use the behavior of turning out of traffic onto a side road, taking a detour, you might get reinforced by having less traffic. Nobody likes traffic. Having less of it is good news, and that's what makes the behavior of taking a detour more likely to be repeated. If you were successful as a detourer, it would mean that you got less traffic. That would be good news. See if you can think of a couple of other examples of both positive and negative reinforcement and post them on the Facebook page. Another use for reinforcement is when we're trying to teach something new, or we're trying to get a person to take something they can do currently and get them better at doing it. Take an existing skill or behavior and get them to do it better or get them to do it more often. So we called this reinforcing successive approximations or shaping. Those two words are essentially the same for us. So what does it mean? It means reinforcing the person for little bits of progress towards that new desired behavior. A classic example of that is when a parent toilet trains a child. The first time a child uses the toilet, the parent starts to give rewards. In fact, the child might get rewarded even for sitting on the toilet or for pulling his pants down and saying, I have to go to the bathroom. And all of those are steps towards the larger goal. Mom and dad would never think of waiting until the child was completely able to use the bathroom on its own before giving a reward. That just wouldn't work. So instead, they would give the child praise and maybe even other rewards like attention or treats as they got closer and closer to being independent in their toilet training. Continuing on with reinforcement techniques, vicarious reinforcement should remind you of a term we learned earlier in the year, vicarious learning. They're very, very similar. Vicarious learning is a concept put forward by Albert Bandura. All it basically means is if we watch other people and we see that what they're doing appears to be successful, we're more likely to do what we see. So that's what vicarious reinforcement is based on as well. Vicarious reinforcement means if I reinforce somebody in the presence of my subject, the subject will learn that the DV is a good thing to do. They will make that connection that if I do it too, I'm probably going to get rewarded. So vicarious reinforcement means I reward the desired behavior in front of my subject. Sometimes, for example, you might see an older child getting rewarded in front of a younger child, or a new student might be brand new in the class and see, for example, here, that the more experienced students are putting their hands up, and when they do that, they get praise, they get their questions answered, and that is why a teacher might want to have a split class, because the older kids doing this in front of the younger kids would set a good example. So that's a proactive strategy. Another example, in this case a reactive example, might sound like this. Mom comes home from a grocery store with a whole bunch of groceries in her car. She comes into the house and she says to her two kids, "I need help carrying in the groceries." One of her children sits and continues to pay attention to the television, but the other one comes out and helps get the groceries. And let's pretend for a moment that the one that helps get the groceries is usually really good at doing that, and the one that's sitting there watching TV is the one that usually does have that problem. What Mom might sneakily do is decide when she comes in to reach into her bag of groceries and take out maybe an ice cream cone and give it to the child that just helped in front of the other one, and point out that that came as a result of the help. And the hope is that the child who didn't help would learn for the next time. So it's a reactive example in that case, because the child who was watching TV didn't execute the desired behavior. They executed the troublesome behavior of staying there inside, and so Mom used it as a response in the hope that it would actually make things better next time. So vicarious reinforcement can be used both ways. Another term we want to start to look at is intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcement. This is another way for us to kind of categorize all reinforcements. Now, it's not in your green book, so if you don't understand it from my lecture today, you might want to look it up. Just Google it. There's a good definition that comes up when you do that. Intrinsic reinforcement is well explained by the very first syllable of the word intrinsic, in. Intrinsic really is reinforcement that comes from within us, and it usually exists as a feeling, a physical sensation inside of our body, or a thought. For example, if we did a job and we felt proud, that would be intrinsic reinforcement. Or if we meditated and felt calm afterwards, that would be intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation comes from outside of us, and a good way to think of that is extra or external when you hear those first 3 or 4 letters. Usually these are extras that are provided by other people. For example, when a child goes to a door and yells trick or treat at Halloween, somebody usually comes to the door and gives them candy as a reward for doing that. And that's an extrinsic reinforcer because it happens entirely outside of the person. When you work hard and your boss gives you a paycheck, you might earn an extrinsic reward because the paycheck comes from somebody else. But some things have both type of reward. For example, let's say you enjoy your job. You not only get a paycheck, but you also have an internal feeling of pleasure. Here's an example of that. Let's pretend Mike went to a first aid class and earned his first aid certificate, which made him feel proud. That was the intrinsic reinforcement. And when he presented his first aid certificate to his employer gave him a raise, so that was extrinsic. It was an extra reward. Another way to separate reinforcement is into the categories of primary and secondary reinforcement. Now, it's really important for me to take a moment and point out that sometimes people think that intrinsic and extrinsic are the same as primary and secondary. They just aren't. They're different things. It's possible for people to have things from different categories. You can have primary intrinsic and secondary extrinsic and primary extrinsic and so on and so on. So don't make the assumption that they're the same thing. So how do I tell the difference between these two things? Well, we can use what's called the baby rule or the survival rule. What does that mean? Well, primary reinforcers are those that we never had to be taught the value of. Just like a baby, any person would understand that food, sleep, relief from pain, being in the company of other people, being sheltered and warm, these are all things that, irrespective of our age, our intellect, our cultural background, are going to be understood by us. They happen at a very instinctive level, we might say. Another way of putting it is the survival rule, the things we need if we're going to survive. Most of those things can easily be seen to fit into the primary category. Secondary reinforcers are those that we had to learn to value. And because of that, they're very individualized. For example, you might not like being hugged, or another person might love being hugged. So even though they're both behaviors they're both a response to a behavior, one person might actually find a hug to be something that's kind of a punishment. Another person might say, I love hugs, I'll do just about anything to get one. A lot of these kinds of reinforcers are abstract. For example, I might say to you, let's go out and have a night of fun. But fun is very abstract. One person's fun might be another person's torture. Or let's go out and make ourselves look pretty. And again, the idea of pretty is different from one person to the next. So secondary reinforcers, the reason we care about this is because we don't just want to make assumptions that the things we like are the things other people like. We have to sit down and do what's called a reinforcement inventory and find out what people like. Now you might want to go and read chapter 9 and find out more about this type of reinforcer. It is in the book, and one of the things you'll be expected to know is the 4 different types or category of secondary reinforcer. I have purposely left that out of the lecture so that I can make sure you go back and actually read the reading. Now we're going to take these ideas of primary and secondary and intrinsic and extrinsic and take them a little bit further. We're going to use them in combination. And when we do that, that's called coupling. It makes sense, right? Taking something and putting it in a pair with something else. So we combine those types of reinforcement so that they have a sustainable positive effect on somebody. Intrinsic and extrinsic are usually what we think about combining because we want people to do what we call internalization. We want them to become less and less dependent on the external rewards and more dependent on the internal feelings that come from doing the desired behavior. We want them to need us less, in other words. So imagine that we said to somebody, Mike, you earned 10 minutes of video game time for cleaning your room. I bet it feels great knowing where all of your toys are now. The video game time is an extrinsic reward. It came from outside of the person. The feeling of feeling great is intrinsic. But a lot of kids never ever really stop and register that feeling, or people with developmental challenges, even if they're adults. What we're doing is making sure that we connect those two things in the way that we deliver the reinforcer. So I would literally say these words to somebody so that I can make sure they are coupling those ideas together. I could even do it with primary and secondary reinforcers. So let's say I'm working with somebody who is developmentally delayed and has difficulty with things that are abstract. I might have to focus more on primary reinforcers. This is a person that would probably want to have something like food as a reinforcer, or maybe one-to-one time with a preferred staff person. So here's an example. Mike, here's a cookie for cleaning your room, and you've earned your allowance this week. Hopefully you could see that a cookie is a primary reinforcer because it's food. An allowance is a secondary reinforcer because it's abstraction. Money is symbolic, and not everybody understands money. Let's apply the baby rule. If you gave a cookie to a baby, what would they do? They'd put it in their mouth, they'd start to eat it, they'd probably quickly realize that it tasted good. If you gave a loonie to a baby, they'd probably do the exact same thing. The only value of the loonie to them would be that it was shiny or smooth. They wouldn't understand that the loonie was worth something that had an abstract value. So it probably would not be worth more to them than the cookie. But if you connect these two things, and gradually over time, you'll start to see that the person would, in many cases, start to understand that their allowance had value too. The abstract thing had value too. So if you're trying to get people to understand abstract or learn things, this is a good way to do it. But you have to eventually remove the stuff that has the person being dependent on you, and that's called fading. So you gradually remove those extrinsic reinforcers, and you might even remove those primary reinforcers. For example, we talked about edibles, and we said we'd really like to try and remove some of the edible reinforcers because using food as a reward has some ethical challenges. We don't want people to get kind of neurotic about food, right? So what we might try to do is gradually remove some of those reinforcers that have the person being dependent on us or dependent on food so that they gradually became more and more self-motivated. That's what fading is all about. We're going to talk a little bit now about token economies. You might have heard this term before. What do you do if a person's troublesome behavior occurs a lot? What do you do if the only things that they value and that we might use as reinforcers are too expensive to give to them all of the time? What do you do if you're worried that they're going to get tired or fill up on their reward and then they'd stop trying? There's a name for this. It's called satiation. If a person gets sick of their reward, then it stops having value. Well, if any and all of these things happen, it might be appropriate for us to use an approach called a token economy. Let's break the term down. A token is an object that on its own has no inherent value, like a poker chip or a ticket. It's used to symbolize something else that has value. For example, tickets are tokens that tell you that you're allowed to be admitted to an event. And money is a token that tells people when you go to a store, hey, this person can take some of the goods in the store. A poker chip might get traded for money, which is an interesting thing because if you think about it, poker chips are tokens and money is a token. So you're trading a token for a token. Economy. An economy is an agreed upon value of tokens. When we talk about money, we all have a rough idea of how much it costs, for example, to see a movie or take a bus. And we would probably not want to spend our money if a person tried to charge us more than that economy. We might be really quick to spend our money if they charged us less. So this is the agreed upon value of our tokens so that we can cash them in for things of real value later on. A real life example of this might be that we come to understand this economy. If I go to Subway and I buy a 6-inch sub, they give me a stamp that I can put on a card. Then, when I have 6 of those stamps, I can cash it in to get a free 6-inch sandwich. So basically, the economy is that agreement. What is worth what? Token economies then reward the desired behavior with a token that can be traded in later on for a reinforcer according to a set economy. For example, we might give a person a poker chip, a token, for raising their hand, the desired behavior. And then, after they've got 6 poker chips, they can cash them in, that's the economy, for 15 minutes of computer time. That's the actual reinforcer. Now, token economies take quite a lot of work, and because of that, it's not always the right approach to take. In fact, I always tell people I would avoid them at almost any cost as a last resort, simply because they are so much more work to create and to implement. So try to do something else if you possibly can. Token economies only fit when these conditions are met. First of all, you have to have a client who can understand the basic abstraction of that economy. Not everybody understands that the poker chips or tickets or puzzle pieces or check marks or stickers that you're using are meant to be the equivalent of something else. Second, the behavior you're reinforcing has to happen frequently, and it's important because we've already learned that an immediate payoff is part of what makes people feel like their behavior is functional. So if a person isn't getting lots of chances to get the token and lots of chances to cash in, chances are they're going to get frustrated and just keep using the troublesome behavior. You also have to have time as a staff group to put the strategy in place because, as I said, token economies can actually be quite a lot of work. If the staff are already busy doing lots of other types of behavioral support or even any other kind of work, we might need to find a simpler strategy. Token economies are only useful if we're worried that a person will be satiated by getting a more frequent reinforcer. Satiated, again, means sick of or full of, satisfied by. So let me give you an example of that. I've worked with individuals with autism that have a very, very short list of things they found reinforcing. Let's use the example of a person who liked chocolate bars and cans of pop. For 2 reasons, we were quite concerned about giving a person a can of pop every time he participated in the desired behavior, which was putting his hand up. If we got him a can of pop every time he put his hand up, it would be really bad for him. He would get sick from eating so much chocolate and pop. And it would also be really unlikely he would continue to be reinforced by that. So he would probably be more than happy to only do the behavior 1 or 2 times a day, which would give him absolutely no incentive to change and move away from his troublesome behavior. In fact, I could add a third problem with that, which is that it would get really expensive. So what we would want to do instead is essentially give the person a part of a bag of chips, a part of a chocolate bar, a part of a can of pop. And we do that by giving them the tokens, and the token is basically a portion or a fraction towards that larger reward. So I would do that if I was worried the person was going to get filled up. In the case of the chocolate bar person and the can of pop person, that's exactly what we were concerned about. And we had to break it down into something that allowed them to get a can of pop once a day and a chocolate bar once a day, because anything more than that wouldn't have been reinforcing anymore. Another thing that's really important to understand is that you'll see people who do token economies that are negative in their strategy. And what this means is that they give the person all of the tokens in advance, and they wait for the person to misbehave, and then they take the tokens back. This is a very problematic approach. Not only are there ethical concerns about it, but it's simply not likely to be effective, because what it does is highlight the problem behavior, and it also leads to friction, feelings of negative self-esteem, and anger. And so it's more likely to promote the negative or undesired behavior, the troublesome behavior I should say, than it is to promote the desired behavior. So instead we want a positive approach. We talked about this earlier. We mean the word the same way here. We're going to add something when the person does the desired behavior. So instead of taking anything away, we give it when they do the right thing. And by the way, once they've got a token, even if they do a problem behavior later on, we never take the token away. Never. So let's wrap up this lecture by getting you and hopefully a partner to take a moment to try some of these exercises. First of all, think of a scenario in which you might use vicarious reinforcement to proactively promote a desired behavior. What about as a reactive strategy? Take a moment and think about this and post them as a comment below. Think of secondary reinforcers that you have personally learned to value using the 4 categories from Chapter 9 of the Competencies textbook. So yes, you'll have to go and find those 4, and then personally identify one from each category, or maybe more than one, that you personally have learned to value. And again, put those in the comments section. And a client needs to be motivated is a scenario. So let's do this scenario. A client needs to be motivated to do his laundry each week. He really enjoys going to Dairy Queen for a sundae. Is this a good scenario for a token economy based on what I've taught you? Why or why not? Again, not only answer the why, the yes or no, but also answer the why or why not in the comments. And one last scenario. At the beginning of the day, Mrs. Hanson gives a student, Jeremy, 3 red cards. If he yells out, she takes one away. If he has all 3 left at the end of the day, he gets to play with the classroom hamster. Is this approach likely to work? Why or why not? Again, put your comments in the paste down below the link, and other people can respond.